during the period of furlough to prevent de-skilling of the workforce. How does that... I'll give you an example. If you're a baker, or to use Dr. Loynig's example, you're a patissier and you're making shoe buns, I think was his example. You can't do that, but you might do some health and safety training, or training about hygiene in the kitchen, or if you're a barrister, you can't go to court, but you might do your CPD points. What do you say about that sort of...
I'd have to... I know that sounds fine. I mean, it depends how much of a burden on the employer it was, is my instinctive answer, and we're getting into kind of the micro policy development. So I think the whole point is here, the businesses were under, and lots of them small businesses, were under enormous stress. We all thought, well, we worried that they were about to go out of business, and the whole point about this thing was to ensure that they didn't have to lay off all their employees, because we wanted to protect that job match and protect that business. So if you're saying to that small restaurant or cafe that shut down, like, by the way, you still have to pay your rent, and we're going to help you with some grants over there and a loan over there, but you've still got a lot of costs that you're grappling with, and you're not operating, and we've done the furlough thing, but you have to now spend, that would be an extra cost, effectively, that you're putting on the business, and I think you would just have to think through that. If the whole point is you're worried about the business going out of business, then you probably say, let me keep you alive, rather than figure out if any extra costs. In principle, clearly, if you've got the time, it feels like a sensible thing to do. I think there has been some survey evidence that suggests that something like 40% of people, it was in your evidence somewhere, or maybe it's in my evidence, I think something like 40% of people did actually undertake some type of training whilst they were furloughed. And obviously now, with all the AI tools that we have, it's quite easy for people to do lots of things online and free, and they'd have the time to do that. I'm not sure about putting an obligation on the business necessarily would serve the ultimate aim of trying to protect the business and the job.
The scheme allowed people to take on work for another employer. So if you were furloughed, you could work for another business. Do you think... I mean, which presumably is a good thing in terms of churn in the labour market. People might find a different job they're actually better at or better suited to, and they could move on. Do you think that was well enough publicised, this ability to work elsewhere?
To be perfectly honest, I don't have a strong recollection of that particular policy and how we communicated it, or how it worked, or how well taken up it was. You have to forgive me.
No, not at all. Can I just pick up one other thought that's emerged, and then we'll take the lunch break. This came from Dr. Brewer, one of the inquiry's experts, and has been picked up in the evidence. The idea that you could have a right to request furlough, and the point Dr. Brewer was making was that whether an employee was furloughed or not was a decision for their employer. So they may not want to lose their job, they may not want to be made redundant. If they were made redundant, then they fell into universal credit and welfare, and comparatively that could be quite a significant fall in income. Not their fault, is the point he was making. So that there should be a right for them not to demand that they're kept on, but to at least request through a process that they be kept on through furlough.
I think that is... look, I have to think a little bit more about that. I mean, probably instinctively, I'm not sure that's what I would do, not least because, especially if you're going to put, as we did, the tapering requirements on employers, where they would have to contribute more, then having someone kind of be able to force their employers, because then you are effectively forcing them to keep you on, not full-time, but at a cost. That seems a bit tricky, right? Those two things then work against each other, and I think ultimately it's the employer's the one that is making the decisions about their workforce, the government forcing them to make those decisions. That doesn't strike me as being quite the right approach, and as I said, would make any type of employer contributions and tapering much harder to defend, and make it more likely then that people are just let go, which I think would not be the outcome that we wanted.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Sunak, I'll leave it there. After the lunch break, what I want to pick up on CJRS is the approach in the autumn of 2020 when JSS was shelved and furlough was extended. So we'll pick that up as an issue after lunch, if we may, my lady. And we're not very far behind my plan, so we're slightly behind, but that's my fault, not yours. But we'll make it up this afternoon.
That's right.
My lady. Mr. Sunak, can we pick up, as I said we would, the position in the autumn of 2020 with the decision to extend the job retention scheme and not to implement job support scheme, open and closed? We understand that the furlough scheme, job retention scheme, was due to end on the 31st of October 2020, to give some context, and was then going to be replaced by the job support scheme as part of the winding down of furlough, essentially. That was the economic planning, if you like, working up the job support scheme whilst looking to end the job retention scheme. But in terms of the health picture, I think, as your statement acknowledges, in that autumn, so September, early September onwards, there were various contingencies being worked up in Whitehall in terms of the health position. Is that right? One of which was the potential towards a further national lockdown if infection rates continue to increase.
Yes, I think that's a fair summary. We went into the design process for JSS on the basis of the initial roadmap exit plan that had been developed, and then I think the tiering system that was put in place. So JSS was very much designed for that world. I think, as I alluded in the statement, we always knew that there was uncertainty around the potential spread and path of the virus. So I'm sure during that period, and there were discussions we had, knowing that might be an option, that would have to be brought back if it went a particular way. So that was always there, and then ultimately, as the health situation deteriorated and the tiering system went and we went back to a national lockdown, it obviously made more sense just to bring CGRS back.
Yes, thank you. Or we'll not bring it back, but just
to extend it. I was just going to correct myself as well. Extend it and not introduce JSS as planned.
Because I think the direction to HMRC to extend came on the day it was due to end, which was the 31st of October.
Yeah, that's which I think, because that was also from memory. I'm just trying to check. I think it was that also the day that it was decided we would change the health restrictions and enter another lockdown from memory. Around is that it was the things were linked.
Yes,
in that sense.
Yes, that's right. The two things were coming together. But in terms of timing, I mean, it's obviously not ideal from a business planning perspective to think one thing may happen and then be told another was going to happen at short notice. That's a slightly different issue, which I'll come back to whether operationally there were any risks in leaving the decision that late, or was the position that because CGRS was up and running and you knew it worked and was deliverable, that there wasn't a great operational risk in switching to CGRS rather than bringing in JSS?
I don't think there was any operational risk from memory at all, because as you rightly said, anyway, it was already in operation and people were used to it, and so that bit was fine. If anything, there would have been operational risk about whatever when you do something new. So in that sense, I have no memory that was an issue at all. Obviously, it was far from ideal that the situation had deteriorated so quickly, and that meant that we had to change what we were doing. But that was very much in response to the deteriorating health situation, which was obviously not something that we were in control over. And it was, I still think, right to, for all the reasons we discussed earlier, right to have tried to develop something that could be more targeted. And I still said, I think that was the right thing to have done and to spend time on. And if we hadn't ended up in that health scenario, would have introduced. And I'm sure it would not have been perfect either, but I think that was a worthwhile thing to have pursued. But as the health situation then deteriorated very quickly, it made sense to stick with CJRS, and that was it really. There's not much more I can probably add to that.
No, and so from the Treasury's perspective, the health situation is determining the economic response.
Yes.
We've already covered that ground. But does this also go back to the other responsibility you had as Chancellor, which is not to spend money where you don't need to spend it? It's all about withdrawing or reducing support when that's appropriate as well.
Yeah, of course. And that it goes right back to the beginning, and all those different economic objectives we have. Of course, value for money, minimising fiscal cost, and allowing that effective recovery of the economy, so that resources are allocated efficiently. To use a slightly more wonky phrase, that is also an important set of considerations, and it makes sense to weight those considerations, especially as you're out of the worst of the health situation, and then can start to iterate policy in that direction. And that's what the plan was. And then obviously the health situation deteriorated, and therefore we had to adjust on the economic support side. But as I said, I don't think it was wrong to have planned for JSS and to have done the work on it and be prepared to implement it had the health situation carried on as originally expected. That was also the right thing to do, and if this happened again in the future, I think someone should look to do that as well at the appropriate time.
Now, I accept that this next question I want to put to you is that it might be characterised as you could be criticised for ending something too soon. You could be criticised for something going on too long. This is the perfection of judgment about timing. But when you look back over CJRS, it was stood up again or continued 31st October 2020 and then eventually ended. Do you think that some over-reliance crept in on to furlough, that it could have been withdrawn sooner? Or how are you making that decision?
I think this is something where we have to be really careful about hindsight. And I think, with the greatest respect, obviously, to Milady and yourself, Mr. Wright, is I think the right question to ask is, at that moment in time, was it a reasonable judgment to make? And I believe that it was. Everyone was worried, anxious about what would happen to unemployment when furlough ended. There were perfectly credible voices who wanted it to go on for longer than it did, including obviously the TUC. I think at least one, if not two or three, of the devolved administrations, finance ministers and leaders. I think the then opposition, now government, members of, and beyond. So there clearly was a debate to be had about it. I thought our approach was about right in that what we did do, and I think Tim alluded to this in his evidence as well, is that because of the tapering and the necessity for employer contributions in those back-end few months, you saw, I don't have the figures to hand, but you did see, as we expected, a pretty strong decline month on month over the last few months. And what we're really talking about when someone asks this question is it's probably a matter of 2 months, because the restrictions really only ended fully in July, at the end of July, and this went on for 2 more months. So I think we're talking about 2 months where the fiscal cost, I think if you look at it, and I'm sorry I don't have the figures to hand, but the fiscal cost for those last 2 months was probably very small because the numbers were low and the employer contributions were higher. So, was it a reasonable judgment to do what we did? I think it was. I think there's nothing that you can, and hindsight, as we said, sure, when it ended, there was not a big spike in unemployment that people feared, and it was fine. So maybe that argues for being able to have done something sooner. I don't. If this thing happens again, it's not obvious to me that there's some learning from that period that would make it easier for someone in my position to make that balance any better than they will have at the time to weigh up these various things, right? There'll be a public debate, there'll be people saying both things, they'll be looking at all the different bits of data as I was about the decline in people on furlough, the resumption of economic activity, it's all these things, taking all these inputs and just having to make a judgment. And as I said, because of the employer contributions, the cost was lower, and that was a good thing. And I think, in the round, we're talking about 2 months. It's not obvious to me that there's a specific learning, as I said, that would help someone next time around fine-tune it by a month better. Yeah. But again, reasonable people can disagree.
I mean, the fact there wasn't a big spike in unemployment, I mean, turning it on its head might be seen as a good thing. In other words, if this was meant to preserve jobs,
yes,
then yeah, the fact lots of people haven't been made unemployed when it ends might suggest a positive.
No, but I think the point that some people would make is because there wasn't, therefore you may have been able to do it earlier. That is the logic. As I said, it's not logic that I necessarily disagree with, but I think there's no way to test the counterfactual. And my point is, I don't think anyone would really say it should have ended whilst there were still restrictions, and they only finished at the end of July. So I think what we're talking about here is a matter of 2 months. And I said, could it have ended 2 months? We'll never quite know what would have happened if we did end it at the end of July. I think in the scheme of things, it was a reasonable judgment to make.
I certainly don't want to apply any sort of perfect hindsight to these sort of judgments, Mr. Sunak, and I didn't mean to imply.
No, and I wasn't implying that you were, but I think it's just, yeah.
But just to take that a bit further, I suppose one of the questions might be: is it possible to, in a future emergency, or would it have been possible in this emergency, to devise criteria that were published, known, that when these things happen, it will end? Because that would be another way of looking at the end of something, to say, well, when these factors are all aligned, then we will bring it to an end.
I can certainly appreciate the appeal of something like that, the kind of mechanical thing. Having sat in the chair and had to make the decision, I'm not sure it can be reduced to, here are 3 formulas, and if X is 5 and A equals 2, then yes, it goes on, and if they're less than that, it stays. It's a subjective judgment based on a range of different variables, which I'm not entirely sure could be reduced to a mechanical formula. Is my sense of it. So, again, we did have a version of that. Obviously, the Prime Minister put those tests in place for thinking about exit from roadmap, but again, they were part quantitative, part qualitative assessments. So it's not as if from the outside someone could have perfect certainty about what it would mean. They could have reasonable understanding, but they were not mechanical formulas even there. So again, we're down to talking about a couple of months. Could we have? Could there have been some set of things we talked about? We would have ended it a month or 2 earlier. I don't know. And I think things, again, you're monitoring this data, Mr. Wright, day by day as things were reopening. There were 4-week gaps, 5-week gaps between each thing. So something had to open, or we reduced, released some restrictions. Then you needed to see how the economy reacted. Were businesses reopening? Were they bringing people back? How were people going out and doing those activities again and spending money? You had to watch that happen in real time. So I'm not entirely sure if you could have done it far in advance anyway, is the other thing. Because this stuff was changing in front of your eyes by the day.
Just turning that proposition of criteria on its head and looking at it the other way, from a sort of business certainty and public confidence perspective, what about in a future emergency saying, well, while certain things are happening, it will not be withdrawn? So turning it on its head. So in other words, whilst we're still locked down, it won't be withdrawn. Or whilst we are under a certain level of restriction. Or again, do you think all the same problems apply?
I'm trying to think. Effectively, that's what was the case, because we had run it to the end of September. the roadmap, I said, released the restrictions at the end of July. The employer contributions and things started coming in July as well. So that was all telegraphed, I think, in the spring, so people had lots of time to plan. And I'm sure I said, I can't quite remember, kind of the implicit understanding, I'm sure, was, well, and if things change, we'll reevaluate, because we've done that. At that point, we'd done that two or three times already. So yeah. I think that was a kind of given. If things got materially worse, then we would obviously relook at the situation. But I think my sense is at the time then we'd given people a good amount of time to plan, and we could handle a little bit of flex if the roadmap slipped to the right, which it did do. By, I think, one step was delayed by 4 weeks from memory. So I think that turned out to be sensible, that we had erred a little bit on the side of caution, because actually we needed some of that buffer, and for it still to then be tapering off as the economy was fully open. So that was sensible. But again, you could argue if that hadn't happened, it would have looked a little bit of a worse decision, because it would have maybe then been a month more than one was needed. So I think my broad thing is, I think we're talking about a matter of weeks, at most 2 months, really. And for me, it's hard to reduce it to something so formulaic. So giving people some certainty, probably erring a little bit on the generous side to deal with any bumps in the road, having the employer contributions come in, so you've got that tapering and self-selection at the same time. That seems to me to strike a reasonable balance, which is what we did. But again, I think it's hard without hindsight to really know if you could have had a high conviction different view. Not least, as I said, because lots of very credible people. It's easy to say now and after it ended. At the time, and I remember being in Parliament and all the interviews I did, I was getting a lot of pushback on the idea this was ending, right? And all the questions I was getting were the opposite. And as I said, from members of the then opposition and more generally, it was very much, this is too premature, and you're just wanting to withdraw support, and you're focused on balancing the books again, and here we go.
Understood. Can I just pick up just one more point on this, though, developing on that point? So those who say, oh, it should have carried on for longer, it could have carried on for much longer. From an economic perspective, so I'm not talking about the fiscal cost of the intervention, but in terms of a longer-term cost or damage to the economy, are there reasons not to have a furlough scheme going on too long that are important? Yes,
absolutely. And I don't think there would be an enormous amount of disagreement amongst that. At least I hope not, because markets allocate resources efficiently for the most part, and that is individual private businesses, people making those decisions. And what when government starts intervening, trying to preserve things in stasis, that is fine for temporary shocks that are specific. But as that becomes more permanent, and it's not just furlough schemes, there's all sorts of other things that governments can do. What you are doing is interfering with the normal mechanism of the market, and in general, you're potentially preserving businesses and jobs which in the long run aren't actually viable or sustainable. And that's never a good long-term thing for the economy. You're inhibiting its productive growth. And what government should be doing is allowing that process to happen, then obviously providing the support for people with training, skills, making sure new businesses can be created easily. Because what you want in a dynamic economy, if you want a fast-growing economy, is you need that. You need that process to happen. You need those businesses which, sadly are not sustainable or viable, to fail. You need new businesses to take their place. Investment needs to go to where it has a highest return. People need to be in jobs which actually are sustainable and can pay them a good wage, not ones that are being propped up artificially by taxpayers. So absolutely, in the long term, that is not a sensible feature of any market-oriented economy.
And so your decisions about ending these sorts of supports were not simply what's the fiscal cost per month of this continuing, but also is there reaching a point where carrying on may do more harm to the economy than stopping?
Yes, and it goes, again, all the way back to that conversation we had at the beginning. If you just remember, I set out those 4 or 5 economic objectives. This was one of them. It was about when the time is right, allowing normal economic activity to resume and that normal market economy to function, because in the long run, that's the best way to raise people's living standards and grow an economy.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are my questions about the job retention scheme. I'm going to move on to the self-employed income support scheme now. I think we've covered most of CJRS. I hope we have. Is there anything before I move on that you wish to add about the scheme? Any point of learning about the scheme, or have we covered that in the questionnaire?
I think we've had a good, comprehensive discussion on it. I think we've covered the reflections as we went through. So, okay. If anything occurs to me, I'll
there'll be an opportunity
tomorrow. Yes, but I think that we've covered everything that I've thought through.
So self-employed income support scheme, and again, I'll just give some high-level statistics from the evaluation that was conducted into that scheme, just to put this into context. So this was an income replacement scheme for self-employed people. The total benefits created by the scheme were estimated to be £19.3 billion, with an accompanying social cost of £5.1 billion. Payments were made quickly post-launch. There was an application date of 13th of May. By the 25th of May 2020, so 12 days later, 88% of claims have been paid out, and 99.4% of self-employed income support scheme claims were paid within the government's own target of 6 working days from the application. So that's just to give some sense of the scale and the assessment of how the scheme landed. I'll ask the question in the way that. Sorry to keep coming back to Dr. Loynig. He's obviously made an impression. But I'll ask the question really founded in the way he put it, and so we can have your response to this. That there was an extent he felt that this scheme was really a trade-off between an economic case for support and a moral political case for support, because this was a very vocal political group lobbying for support, whereas morally, perhaps, I don't know if morally is the right word, but that's how he put it, not as deserving as the job support provided through CJRS. What was your rationale for the scheme, and why do you say it was necessary and important, Mr. Sunak?
I think, taking a step back, it was at its most simple level, the government stopping people from working and doing what they wanted to do, and therefore having some responsibility to support them through that period, and that applies equally to those who are self-employed as it does to those in work. And of course, we've spoken through the economic theory of scarring and labour matches, and that's all true. But actually, put the economic bit aside, there's just a slightly more fundamental thing that everyone was going about their day-to-day life, trying to work hard, provide for their families, build a better life. Government comes in and says, no, sorry, we're not going to let you do that anymore. And I just didn't think it would be right to then not have something to say to those people to support them through it. And that really is what the self-employment support scheme was about. And it broadly, not perfectly, but broadly was designed to give comparable support to those who are self-employed as those who are in employment. I think Tim, in his evidence, also said that he thought it was perfectly reasonable to him as an economist that the self-employed and employed should, in some loose sense, have the same level of support, and this is the kind of closest that we could do, and that was what he said, and I think that's right in a nutshell, and we can get into the design of it, but that was the kind of thesis behind doing it from my perspective.
Can I interrupt? Sorry.
Of course, Maria.
Doesn't the economic scarring argument apply to the self-employed too? Because an awful lot of self-employed people, I confess I have an interest here, having been self-employed for a long time, but don't a lot of put me to one side. Don't a lot of self-employed people contribute to the economy? Don't you have the economic scarring argument can apply to a lot of self-employed businesses?
Not to make Tim. I think if Tim was here, he might say the difference, milady. I'm going to try and make his argument for him, not mine. But I think he would say that the difference is that nothing stops you as a self-employed individual doing what you want to do thereafter. Whereas if you're employed and you lose your job, you can't automatically just go back to doing what you were doing before. That, I think, is not to put words in his mouth, but he might have said something to that effect when he was here. That's why he might say that they are different. I tend to broadly sympathise with your perspective on it. At the end of the day, these are people who we wanted to make sure that they were still able to be economically productive and active when possible. And therefore, providing some support to them would make that more likely. I think the TUC provided some good evidence on this point, and I think Kate was quite good on this particular point. That I think she gave the example of a self-employed salon or hairstylist or beautician who would have had a bunch of things, may have even had paid rent in somewhere, and if they had not been supported, all of that would have gone. Would have had to sell all of that, broken all those relationships with wherever she was, those client relationships, etc., and therefore would not as easily be able to bounce back. And it's effectively like having been let go in a company. So I think Kate would give you the example of something that very much is in line with what you said, and that was my general sense. Now, I think Tim would say that's perfectly fair. It probably doesn't apply to everyone in quite the same way as it did with people in jobs. But I hope I've given you as fair as I can.
You're very good at playing devil's advocate.
Yeah, well, I try and be fair. Obviously, I introduced the scheme and believe in it, so of course, I think that it was the right thing to do, and I would do it again if it was me. And quite candidly, I'm highly confident if this ever happens again, whoever is in my shoes will do something very similar as well. But I'm just at least trying for the sake of you having the full set of arguments. But I thought Kate's evidence on this was quite compelling as bringing it to life how someone who is self-employed actually would have the same scarring type of impact that you would have from someone who is employed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And as with the job retention scheme, what was speed of delivery and simplicity an important feature of the scheme?
Yes, as simplicity, especially, and I think we haven't touched on it, but just actually your last question of the last session. There's an enormous amount of operational pressure that's put on HMRC at this moment in time, and then we'll come on to universal credit this afternoon and with DWP systems. And I think it's easy to kind of abstract that away, particularly for people who are not used to having to deliver things on the front line. And the scale of these things is enormous. You have to remember that 10 million people were furloughed. Right? 1 million businesses were interacting with the HMRC CGRS system, and then 10 million people were getting the rebates through. On SAYS, 3 million people, right? Again, so there's not just a kind of simplicity for speed, a simplicity for communications and reassurance, which we've touched on. There's also a simplicity because what you don't want is for the organisation to be overwhelmed, for the systems to be break down. They only have the capacity to do so much. And there's actually, even in peacetime, that is the case. As Chancellor afterwards, when you're sitting down with HMRC and you're figuring out here are the various upgrades we can make to the tax system, if we invest here, what systems can we do? It's not as if you can do everything at once. And I had those conversations with them on making tax digital. There's well, you want us to design this over here, you want us to do that over there, and this there. Well, thanks, Chancellor. Actually, well, we can't do all of that at once. Please tell us which order you want to do it in. And that's not unfair. And obviously, at this period, that was also the reflection. And they would constantly rightly say, look, we can handle this. If you want us to do this, this, and this, it's going to take you that much longer, or we just simply are going to get overwhelmed, and then things won't work properly. So, that aspect of it, I think, is worth highlighting.
Yeah, you could have promised all sorts of support, but if it was utterly undeliverable, then it wouldn't have been support at all. It would have just been an empty promise.
Exactly, and then that obviously damages confidence and reassurance and all the rest of it. So, and that, and again, you have to trust. I mean, of course, you probably heard this from other people giving evidence. I always was on the pushy end and demanding end. Whether it's with my officials in the Treasury or with HMRC, what's the quickest timeline? Why can't you do more? Why can't we do it faster? But ultimately, you don't want the things to fall over. I think that would be a disaster. So,
and if you look at simplicity as between CJRS and SAYS, in CJRS, this was administered through the PAYE system, which gave you a monthly snapshot of employment, real-time information. So that's pretty good data, and it's regular. But under the self-employed income support scheme, you were looking at income tax self-assessment, and there's a time lag, isn't there, in terms of filing? And so did that present an immediate challenge in terms of deliverability?
Yeah, well, it presented, well, in one sense, it made things very easy because there was no other way that you could do this other than relying on the ITSA system, the income tax self-assessment system. It was the only database that we had in government, the HMRC, that told us who was self-employed, how much had they earned, right? So there was no alternative. So in that sense, that was clarifying and made things simple. But then that meant that came with a set of constraints. Notably, the data, as you alluded to, Mr. Wright, is quite out of date. And that's a feature of our self-employment assessment system where you filed your tax return the following January after the tax year ends. So lots of people who were newly self-employed in the most immediate preceding tax year to the onset of the pandemic had not yet filed a tax return, and we had no way of knowing who they were, how much they earned, and it was therefore not possible to bring them into the system at the outset without taking on what I considered to be unacceptable, risk on fraud. And then as soon as we passed the deadline for that, we were able to bring them in. But that's why the ITSA system was used. And as I said, in one sense, it was very good because it was an accurate database of people and their incomes. The flip side was it was the data in it was out of date, and I'm sure we can talk about what that would look like in the future.
Well, can we pick up about the data point now, and then we'll come on to the point you've just made about appetite for risk and fraud. In terms of the future and data, and you've mentioned this already, making tax digital, and you said that this is something HMRC was working on, and it's now working much further through the system. Can you just explain what it is and how it will change potentially these sorts of judgments for a chancellor in the future?
Yes, I think we are, and I have to confess I'm not sure where the new government is with the roadmap, but before I left the Treasury, we put in place, together with the ministerial team, a new roadmap for making tax digital, partly so that in the future this type of situation would not happen. And what that means is HMRC will be able to collect more income data, same data more regularly.
Quarterly returns?
Quarterly returns, exactly.
Yeah.
And I say, forgive me for not remembering the precise details of who that applies to when, but the broad principle is the system will be much more up to date with what's happening in people's lives than it was when I was doing this, and that will make this easier. Fair to say, before the pandemic, when things like that had been mooted, I don't think everyone was jumping up and down and being super excited about doing that, because people would prefer to have the time and do it later, and all the impact it might have on people's cash flow and taxes. But the pandemic showed why it would be beneficial, at least from this perspective, to have that quarterly tax information from making tax digital. Yeah. So,
okay, you didn't have the luxury of that. You had income tax self-assessment, and you've explained why. Therefore, the newly self-employed weren't eligible in the early cohorts of this support. Can I just pick up? You referenced the risk of fraud. Now, presumably that's because if you wanted to include the recently self-employed, you'd have to effectively self-certify or have some method of self-certifying that they were in fact self-employed, they did in fact have income, and they were in fact eligible.
The whole thing would be completely just as you described.
Yeah. So that's the first point. Is there not also, and we picked this up with Sir James Hara in his evidence, there was also and this touches on something you said earlier about the pressure HMRC was under. Not only would there have to be self-certification, but there'd have to be a manual process of checking and accreditation, which goes hand in hand with that.
And that goes to the point I was talking about earlier, that just the operational demands on HMRC. Any time that HMRC have to start doing any degree of manual verification of anything or spot checking of any kind of scale, clearly the resource implications are significant, which is why when ITSA is great because it can all be done largely digitally, and that means that there isn't a huge human component to that bit. So that Jim's absolutely right to make that point. And you see that in other areas. Now, you make some exceptions for some very small groups of people with a particular case, and I think women on maternity leave and things like that on CJRS, we made some very specific manual flexibilities because we felt that group of people really should not be disadvantaged in any way, and it was a small enough group of people that we could manage a manual workaround. But to Jim's point on this, that would have been a huge undertaking.
Now we know that in the devolved administrations, support schemes were stood up to support the newly self-employed who weren't eligible for the UK-wide self-employed income support scheme. For example, the newly self-employed hardship fund in Scotland. And I asked Kate Forbes about this when she gave evidence, and I put it to her, was it really a question of the Scottish government had a greater appetite for risk than the UK government? It was willing to take the risk of self-certification. But did you consider exploring that and engaging with the devolved administration to see if there's any learning there, or had you made a decision that the risks and the processing obstacles were too great?
I can't recall specifically on that discrete intervention, but more generally on SAYS, because it had to be designed in a way with various different criteria, all of which were necessarily imperfect. There was a continual debate, discussion, re-look at policy to see what could be tweaked, if things could be changed, not least because there was a huge amount of incoming into the Treasury about all these issues. So it absolutely was not the case that it stood up, announced it, off you go, done. I think the entire time that this scheme was in place, in terms of incoming to please can you change this, please can you change that, what about this, is probably the scheme where we had the most of that, actually. And that goes to our earlier question on targeting on CJRS. Here, this was targeted. It was imperfectly targeted because that's all you could do. And then you spend a huge amount of time with all the people who are not captured and feel that they should be, and then trying to figure out if you can tweak the design. And so that's kind of interesting observation on that. But I can't remember on that specific one, but as a general point, I would say that there was constant looking at all aspects of this to see if there are things that could be tweaked, changed, iterated as we went through, because by its design it was certainly more imperfect than CGRS was. Yeah.
So if you think about the heat that you got externally from the imperfect targeting of this scheme, amplify that 100-fold and think about how CGRS would have gone if you'd have tried to target.
I think that is a fair reflection or takeaway. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Can we just run through a couple of other, if you like, hard edges in the scheme? And this goes to this targeting point you've made. The 50% self-employed income test. So this was, you had to have at least 50% of your income from self-employment to be eligible under the scheme, and there was no tapering. It was effectively a cliff edge. Can you just help us with the rationale for that?
Yes.
And whether you considered a taper and why it was not workable.
I think it's interesting in how you introduced the question, Mr. Wright. You talk about the hard edges, and I think that's exactly it. See, one person's targeting is another person's hard edge, right? And those are two sides of the same coin. So, an abstract discussion about targeting is all good and well from an economic theory perspective, and then here is an example where we're going to go through now the various things we did to try and target it. And we end up having the conversation about the hard edges completely reasonably. But I think it just illustrates the challenge with this, because there is no perfect targeting. And anyone who comes here and says, well, with this bit of data, it would have been, perfect, I think is probably not being, I think, realistic about this in the future. So that you have to accept, well, I'm not avoiding your question, we'll get into it, that you have to accept in all these things, there's always just going to be a trade-off. And I think I'd say reasonable people can disagree on those trade-offs, but targeting is beneficial for objective 4 and 5, but it's less good for 1, 2, and 3, and some people are going to feel aggrieved. So that is the nature of it. But on the 50% criteria, and again, this was something that was suggested by officials, which I agreed with. The idea here was, look, remember, all we are doing here is people are going to opt in, and that's an important thing, actually, which we should come to. But people are going to opt in to saying that they need this. So that is really our only kind of check. It's not the same as an employer who's putting someone on furlough. We don't know about this person's circumstances, really. Are they affected by the pandemic? Are they the person who's stylist, or we've closed down that industry effectively, we've prohibited close contact, or are they someone who's happily carrying on working? We don't know. So it is right to try and target where we can to minimise the fiscal impact and sharpen it a bit on those who really need help. The 50% criteria was designed to say that there's lots of people who have some self-employment income. But what this scheme is really there for is to help the people whose life largely is dependent on self-employed income, who are self-employed. The self-employment activity that they carry out, is really the main way that they and their family have financial security. So, in that vein, saying that your self-employment income had to be, and I think the advice recommended 2 options, either greater than 50%, or you could have been a bit stricter and said greater than 2/3 of your overall income, doesn't seem an unreasonable approach to take. That's what this criteria did. And I think that from memory, the median kind of self-employment income from those people who were not eligible because of this criteria was, I think, something like £4,000 or £5,000, right? So it was not their primary source of overall income, and we could target help on those for whom it was. That was the thesis behind this particular threshold. And again, you could, the advice had an option of 2/3, which would have been stricter. We went with 50%, which was a little bit more broad and generous.
And in terms of 50%, 2/3, no magic in the number.
No.
You just had to.
No.
You had to arrive at a number.
Had to arrive at a number, and I think reasonably people could have done 2/3. 50% is like, at least the majority of your income is coming from self-employment. Seems a kind of minimum bar to cross to be calling yourself self-employed or to have a scheme that's supporting you. So that seemed probably the generous interpretation relative to 66% or 2/3.
Now I appreciate this next question may sound like, well, you could say you could pick anybody who's a loser and put a scenario, but I just want to pick this up, thinking about the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable. For those who say had a low-paid job and a small pot of self-employed income on top of that self-employed income might be what made the difference between the wage that they earned in their job and being able to provide for their family.
Yeah.
What they would fall in the gap in the scheme, but what would your reaction to that be in terms of how you can design out of that, how anyone can design out?
Well, I mean, they can't. So you will. I'm 100% sure with everything that we did, as big and as comprehensive as it was, and we talked about the scale, you will always be able to find individual people who, for whatever reason, don't quite meet the exact criteria because of their particular circumstances. It would be wrong to pretend otherwise. Of course, that was the case. So what you can then do is make sure you've got lots of different types of support, so that even if someone doesn't get something over here, they will get picked up over here. And that's why we'll come on to universal credit later this afternoon. Probably the person that you're describing would be eligible for universal credit and would have benefited from the changes we made there. Similarly, we also provided the hardship fund to local authorities, which was the most discretionary of pots, which was effectively a way of saying that for people who, for whatever reason, just need some extra help, who we have not been able to find through all these dozens of things that we've set up, they can talk to their local authority at a very local level, and those people know those families, and get that extra assistance from them. And so that was and then we topped that up a couple of different times through the pandemic, so there was always funding there. I could go on, but straight away, those are two other things that probably would have helped the person that you're describing.
So I think your principal point is, whilst I am in my questioning focusing on one scheme at a time and looking at that scheme in isolation and identifying gaps in it, you would say this is one of many schemes that government was introducing, and you have to look at the panoply of support in different ways that was available, not just look at a hard edge in Scheme A rather than...
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Having said that, can we just pick up one other hard edge, if you like, which is the other untapered hard edge of the £50,000 income criteria. So earn £50,001, no support, earn £49,999 support. And in particular, I'm just interested in the consideration given to a taper, because there'd been a taper in the high-earning child benefit
charge.
And if you did consider it, why you didn't, and the rationale, please.
Yeah. So I think first, again, we're trying to target this thing on those who most need it, and 50k just being as it was then, the threshold for higher rate tax. So what first thing is, this did not mean that many people as a percentage were ineligible. I think the number was 4 or 5%. So as a result of this, I'll get onto the taper question in a minute. So as a result of this bit of targeting, focusing the scheme on those who earn less than 50k, it meant that around 5% of people were ineligible. So it was not, in the scheme of things, a huge number. And the average income of those people was, I think, £200,000. Just again, now that's me sitting in the Treasury looking at the macro statistics. You absolutely could find someone who £50,001. I'm confident of that. But in aggregate, we're talking about 4 to 5% of people, average income of about £200,000. So that's the backdrop. So why? And so given that, why? Also then why not a taper? Look, tapers are complex. I mean, anyone who's tried to sit there and with that hick-bick taper will tell you that. And in this particular instance, there were two reasons we didn't do it. One is, as you heard from Jim Harrow, the Perm Sec at HMRC, it would have delayed implementation significantly by a matter of several weeks, I think, from memory, but he's been clear about that. So a taper would have delayed implementation because of the complexity of it. And generally you do tapers because there's a behavioural impact of them, and you're trying to not have economic behaviour be distorted by a cliff edge, and that's the rationale for doing tapers generally. In this instance, these were, in theory, one-off payments based on an income that you had earned in the past, so there was less argument that this was going to have a behavioural impact and therefore was worth the extra time delay and hassle of putting in a taper, especially given the as a percentage smaller number of people who are actually impacted by it in any case.
So a potential claimant couldn't think, well, I'll delay putting in that invoice because I don't want to go over the amount, because we're talking about a year past.
Well, it was a backwards-looking. At this point, it was a backwards-looking thing. You couldn't do anything about it anyway. So
no, all right. Just want to pick up, I suppose, looking at this the other way, the other argument. There are elements that were too generous in the sense that, and this is a point that Dr. Brewer picked up in his report, that you could say that the lack of conditionality, it being a condition that you have lost income to a significant extent, meant that some self-employed people who didn't really need the support were being given it, and that got tightened up over time, didn't it, in terms of the certification?
And again, I didn't see one. I'm not sure that I've seen a way that you could have done that during this. I mean, we had the long conversation on targeting in CGRS, which I won't repeat, but there really is no way to do that during. What we did do and could do, because I don't disagree with the premise at all. Of course, I'd rather really focus this on people who most need it. Of course, I would prefer to do that. When we could, we did, and you saw, but that really took until 2021, because by then you'd had, a kind of year of the pandemic, and what you were able to do then for the last two grants, I think it was, in the summer and autumn of 2021, you were able to say, well, we had a pandemic last year, spring 20 to spring 21, so now we're going to separate these grants out, and it's going to be a function of how much your revenue declined, your income declined or trading profits declined in the last year. So as soon as we could inject some degree of targeting, we did, and I think that was sensible. So we had two levels of grant depending on your turnover, income, or income decline. Again, reasonable people would disagrry potentially on where you set those thresholds, but principle I agree with. When we could do it, we did do it, but I don't know how you could have done that during the previous year very easily. The only thing I have heard, and I think this is probably something for people to think about in the future, is I think actually maybe Dr. Brewer mentioned this, was whether one might want to consider a clawback if turnover didn't ultimately fall down. So in that 2021 year, you could say, we're going to give these SAYS grants. If it turns out next year when you file your tax return that you're fine, then we'll have that grant back.
Claw it back through self-assessment. You
can claw it back through self-assessment. Now, I think you need some extra legal powers to do that from memory, because I think we looked at it the following year. I think you need primary legislation from memory, but you need. I think that would require legislation. There's obviously an operational complexity to that the next year, which HMRC would be best placed to answer as to how feasible that is, and it would obviously have a behavioural impact on the margin, because people would then be figuring out, well, I might not bother working because I'd rather have the grant. And again, someone would have to model that out. It's not a crazy idea, and I think someone would want to work through all of that to see if it was feasible or practical. But absent that, I haven't seen a way that you could do the targeting in real time in that first year of the pandemic.
But in terms of having a suite of policy options available, if it was deliverable and there was the legislative power to do it, something worth exploring and at least having on the table.
Not an unreasonable thing to explore. I think the other thing that we did do, and which I thought was probably underappreciated, was kind of a good amount of behavioural economics in the application forms for SAYS. There was a kind of affirmation that which had no real legal force, but you had to kind of tick something that says, I have been impacted by the pandemic, and my business has been impacted by the pandemic, and therefore would like to claim this grant, or some variation of that language, and then it got tightened up over time into something called a reasonable belief test, or I have a reasonable belief that I have, etc. And I said I don't think it had legal force. but it had quite a good behavioural force to just, on the margin, hopefully make people think, should I really be claiming this? And actually, you know what? Interestingly, I was just checking the numbers before today. Given that anyone could have got this thing, right? There was no real way, there was no reason they shouldn't get it, even if they were working, in reality. The first grant had an application rate of take-up rate of 77%. So even in that first grant, with very little of this, a quarter of the people self-selected in not claiming it when they could have, then that went down to 69%, 65%. 58%, and by the last grant it was 38%. So just kind of interestingly, even when people were able to claim, that was good affirmation of human behaviour. It's quite good actually. That nudge, I'm sure, making people tick that box, would have contributed to people actually not taking it if they didn't really need it, which is a good thing. And those numbers tell a story of an improving economy through the pandemic as well, and people are adjusting. But I think the nudge is worth bearing. I would certainly recommend that in general.
Those figures may be an argument against conditionality, in the sense that, again, if you assume that general economics people want to go out and earn money and make profit, then when they can, they will.
Yeah. The flip side here is that they could do that and still get the grant.
Yes,
and that is the great challenge of this, you see. That is different to CJRS and the employer discussion. And that is the challenge with this scheme, is that you could do that and still claim the grant. But that's why we had the nudge that you had to tick. Which in theory should help with that, and then later on, and we had the other criteria, and then obviously when we had the revenue information, I think we called it a financial impact test, fit test or FID or something like that, which we introduced.
I know this is fairly granular, but I just want to pick it up briefly on the sort of the fraud front. We understand there was an issue about being able to check across between SAYS and universal credit to see if people were claiming both, and that was really a data issue.
Yes, I saw that in the evidence that you supplied to me last week. I must say, it's not something that I recall.
Well, I won't take it any further.
During the pandemic itself, and look, clearly, if there's a way to do some checking that would, I don't know who. I couldn't quite tell who wanted the data. It felt like DWP wanted the data from HMRC rather than the other way around, but it's not something that I remember being ever raised with me.
No. All right. One other particular group I just want to pick up on, just for your reflections really, but this is company owner managers, so those who essentially own companies and choose to pay themselves through dividends rather than drawing a salary, so they're receiving their income in a different way. I mean, really, did the decision not to do something for that group come down to, well, if they chose to manage their tax affairs in that way, that was a matter for them, or what's your rationale?
No, that it's not that. We actually, much like JSS, and as I was saying about this scheme, this was something that we kept coming back to look at different ways, and the team probably got tired of me going over this and over this again. And every time they thought I'd, just said fine, I'd come back to it a month later because someone had said something to me, or I'd thought of some new idea, or someone had pitched some new idea to me about how we might fix this issue. So it was not a desire not to. I mean, we spent a lot of time, and I think that HMT evidence will show that we spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out if there was a solution here. I mean, look, in a nutshell, that it's a system, the tax system, can't distinguish between dividends that people receive as a return on capital and dividends that people are receiving effectively as a form of labour income, right? We have no way of knowing, looking at the HMRC system, what those, the dividend is dividend. Could be dividend from someone who's doing absolutely no work as a nice equity portfolio and is clipping a dividend, and great, and over here it's someone who's a company owner manager, and that is effectively their income every year, and we have no way to differentiate between those two things, and that is the challenge. And we looked at all sorts of ways of trying to do it there's a closed company director tick box on forms. We went through that, but not everyone ticks it, and not the right people that do tick it even do necessarily fill it in properly. The timing of dividends is obviously very much in the gift of the director, so it's not as predictable. We looked at whether you could use accountants, but they still don't eliminate the need effectively for self-certification, with obviously all the fraud that comes with that. And there really was no one actually knew how many people this was. So what we did know is that about 3.3 million people file tax returns that have dividend income in there. But I think broadly, most people thought the number of company owner managers in the classic sense of it probably was around about 700,000. And that's where you can start to see the issue. So if you just took all the dividend income and said, well, do a version of SAYS for dividend income, I think 3 out of every 4 grants that you would have handed out would have gone to people who actually dividends were just a return on their savings, not their labour income, and that is a very, very tricky thing to resolve. I think your expert, Dr. Brewer, looked at this, and I think he agreed that it was very, in his words, very difficult to establish something, and there would be very large forward risk in doing something. But we did look at it multiple times, believe you me, and just couldn't quite find a way through.
So this wasn't a decision not to support a group. It was a decision very much that you would have looked at something if you couldn't find a way of doing it in a deliverable way that minimised unacceptable levels of fraud and so on.
Yeah.
And by the sound of it, you've come at this every which way, and there still isn't an obvious solution that presents itself.
No, I don't think that there is really.
No.
It's my reflection on it. Again, someone in the future might decide to do something different. But I mean, you clearly could. I mean, you could clearly just look at everyone who had dividend income in a tax return and send them an equivalent of a SAYS grant calibrated. You would do that with the 3/4 of grants by volume and more by pounds going to people who you were not really trying to help. So you could accept that, but I don't. To me, that would not seem like the right judgment to make.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now from the self-employed scheme into Kickstart. And just again, some context. Now, this was part of your plan for jobs announced by the Treasury on the 8th of July 2020, a £2 billion fund to create hundreds of thousands of high-quality 6-month work placements. It was aimed at 16 to 24-year-olds on universal credit, deemed to be at risk of long-term unemployment. Funding covered 100% of the national minimum wage for 25 hours a week, and the associated employer national insurance contributions, and the employer minimum automatic enrolment contributions. And in terms of assessment, the evaluation found the majority of leavers at 7 and 10 months, that's 63 and 66%, who are in work, said that the skills and experience they gained have been important in helping them find work. And you've spoken already, Mr. Sunak, about your desire to support employment and jobs in the pandemic and putting that at the forefront. This is targeting young people in particular and trying to get them into work. Was there particular significance in trying to target that group of young people, 16 to 24?
Yes, that was something that weighed on me quite heavily throughout the pandemic, was an understanding that young people were particularly at risk, and that's because they were 2.5 times more likely to work in the most affected sectors. And we also know that if young people have a bad interaction with the labour market early in their careers, if they're not able to find stable work when they're young, that has an impact on them for a long time to come. And it goes back to the scarring that we talked about right at the beginning. So, I was particularly worried about this cohort throughout, and obviously different modules have looked at the impact on education and those outcomes. But, even for those young people who are just entering the labour market, those early years are really important in getting into good work habits, finding good, stable employment. That sets you up for life. And obviously what was happening with the pandemic was disrupting that. So, I had that in the back of my head, and Kickstart was as a way to target a job intervention program at that group and try and help them make sure that they have that experience of being in the labour market, being in work.
Yeah. And we understand from your statement that the Treasury was particularly involved in the design of Kickstart, and but also that you had a very keen personal interest in that scheme. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I saw that. I'm not entirely sure what I mean. I had a personal interest in all of these things because I needed to make sure they all worked, and ultimately I was responsible and accountable for the overall economic response. But this as an idea actually came from the TUC, and probably Francis and Kate won't love me keep referring to them, but I think we had a good, productive working relationship during this period, and it was something that they had called for. Others had called for it as well from memory, but I distinctly remember Frances O'Grady, as she was then, Baroness Grady now, and Kate talking about this. It was modelled on something called the Future Jobs Fund, which is a programme that had existed in 2008 from memory, and actually, I heard it and I thought that that sounds good, and we should be looking at something like that because of the concerns I had about the impact on young people, and I mentioned it to Therese Coffey at DWP, and as you've seen from her evidence, they took the idea and they led it, essentially. I mean, obviously we worked very closely together, and this is a good example of that policy partnership and the cells, and we were doing things really closely together, iterating together. But they obviously had primary responsibility for delivering this scheme, and we designed it together, and off they went and did it. And Mims Davis, who was the junior minister at the time, they took a lot of personal ownership of it, and it was a great collaboration. And I was always really, lots of the things that we did made a difference to people, and your stories video brings that to life. But I particularly, meeting young people who, because of this scheme, were in a job that they may not otherwise have had, and then being set up for life, I thought was a particularly good and positive outcome.
Now, the timing of the implementation of Kickstart, we understand it was stood up quite quickly, announced in July, and was going live in November of 2020. And was that because, at the time it was announced, the expectation was that furlough would have ended on the 31st of October, and therefore there may be a spike in unemployment, and there may be a lot of young people who would need help getting into jobs? Yeah,
exactly as you said. It was designed in the context of the pandemic, and the restrictions are all winding down. The support schemes are winding down. We're going to focus now on jobs and creating new jobs and getting people into jobs. And this is an intervention that would be targeted particularly at young people.
Yeah. Of course, had you known what you came to find out in November, the timing suddenly looks different come November when we're going back into lockdown and you're extending furlough. And did you find that frustrating, really, that the scheme had been stood up very quickly? And you might know what it means, but it was described as a minimum viable product. In other words, it was stood up as, it could do what it said on the tin, but it wasn't particularly well worked or long worked up.
Yeah, of all the things that were frustrating to me during this period, I mean, that particular one probably was not that high on the list, but of course it was frustrating because it meant that this thing was not up and running in the way that we would have imagined when we announced it. That said, it's good that we've done the work, good that we got it up and running, and this point about minimum viable product, this really is proof of the test and learn iterative approach to policy making. And this is the thing. It's like we were saying, one person's targeting is another person's hard edge. That again, people like the sound of test and learn, iterative policy making. Then what that means is what you put out there straight away is by definition not going to be perfect, most likely. But you're prioritising getting it out there. That's what the minimum viable product is. We know it's going to basically work, and we'd rather just get it out there. Because then it can start to make a difference, and we can learn as we go and adjust it as we go, and do that in kind of reaction to what's happening in reality rather than in sitting in the meeting room. And this was a good example of that type of approach to policy making. Again, not optimally in the end able to be executed because kind of another lockdown got in the way, which was, as you said, frustrating.
But can I pick up that point about developing as you go? I mean, it was the indicative target was for 250,000 placements. Ultimately, there are 168,000 young people who had the benefit of a kickstart place. One issue was whether the eligibility should be expanded beyond universal credit, and so should include young people who are receiving JSA, for example, a legacy benefit. Or expanded to include people who were in receipt of a PIP, personal independence payment, disabled people. If there wasn't the take-up, and if you were learning as you went, do you regret not expanding it to fill the places that were envisaged and expanding its reach?
I can't recall the kind of micro eligibility decisions and what the exact basis for each of those was. I think part of the reason that it didn't end up, I mean, still 150,000 young people benefited from this, and enormous credit to the team at DWP who did stand it up and deliver that, because I think it made a huge difference to those young people. It was because actually the economic recovery was stronger than we had anticipated it would be. I don't think that should necessarily be a sign of failure of the scheme. Actually, we didn't see the spike in youth unemployment that everyone had predicted when furlough ended. The economy, we know after all the revisions happened, 2 years later, recovered far faster during this period than initially it was given credit for. And unemployment stayed relatively low. And actually, so it's because we go back to this point before, the private sector, the regular market functioning of the economy was happening, and jobs were being created, and so there was less need for the subsidised jobs through Kickstart in that sense. It was. I don't think you want to focus on a group of people